Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to make that last check. Thank you, David, that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. Very much appreciated by our speakers. We, of course, will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. And those who are listening on the internet are welcome at any time to send their questions or comments to us via email, simply to speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our guest today is Becky Norton Dunlop, who serves as Vice President for External Relations here at Heritage. She oversees our outreach and communication strategically, both nationally and internationally, to conservative public policy institutions, other leadership organizations, as well as policy activists. Prior to joining Heritage in 1998, she served as Secretary of Natural Resources for the Commonwealth of Virginia in the cabinet of Governor George Allen. She has also held significant roles in the Reagan administration as a Deputy Assistant to the President for Presidential Personnel, Special Assistant to the President and Director of his Cabinet Officer, and then she joined Edwin Meese as Senior Special Assistant to the Attorney General, and later to the Department of Interior with Secretary Don Hodel as Undersecretary of the Department and Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Becky Dunlop. Becky?
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. On behalf of the Heritage Foundation, let me welcome each of you who have come here today to hear our very special guest. As I was reviewing the paper that our guest is going to speak about today and thinking about the author, I was reminded of a number of people in my history who have done seminal works that helped change the direction of the debate on sound science and natural resource policy. And I won't tell you how far back that goes, but the name Dixie Lee Ray might be familiar to some of you here in this audience, and if you don't have her books, you should find them. She was probably the first. I'd like to recognize Fred Singer, who's in the audience today, who's another one of those people who has done world-changing work in this area. But I think that today we have an author, a speaker, who's taken upon herself to do another major piece of research work that has the likely benefits of helping change the discussion and the trajectory of the discussion about a natural resource policy in our country and indeed in our world. I have known this lady for quite a few years. We first met during the Reagan years, and we were in different areas of work, but both involving natural resource policy. And her efforts have continued up until this very day, and she's done a lot of very exciting and beneficial work for the people who care about natural resources and want to manage them based on good science as well. Kathleen Hartnett White is our speaker today here at the Heritage Foundation. She is currently with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which she joined in January of 2008. And she's the Distinguished Senior Fellow in Residence and Director of the Armstrong Center for Energy and the Environment. Prior to that, she did serve in government. She was the 6-year term chairman of the Commission of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, with regulatory jurisdiction over all air quality, water rights, and utilities, storage, and disposable waste in Texas. An enormous responsibility for a great state with a dynamic and growing economy. She worked here in Washington, D.C. for a number of years on natural resource and environmental and energy policy before she returned to Texas. Both Governor Bush and Governor Rick Perry saw the merits of putting her in particular offices to provide leadership in this area. She is a principled leader. She has been a supporter of the American conservation ethic, which outlines the 8 key principles that should guide public policy in this area today. But the work that she's going to talk to us about today and the paper that she's releasing, Fossil Fuels, the Moral Case is an important document, and I know that you will join me in welcoming Kathleen Hartnett-White to our podium for this presentation.
Thank you all for coming, and I must, with massive amounts of heartfelt admiration, thank Becky very, very much, my colleague for many years, and also Rob Gordon, colleague for so many years. And it is a delight to be here and share this paper. As Becky mentioned, my previous work of many decades, I'm afraid to admit, really focused on technical aspects of environmental and energy policy, legal aspects, scientific aspects, and policy aspects. I felt like during the time I was chairman of the state's large environmental regulatory agency, rather an odd job for someone that champions limited government, I felt like I lived inside the Clean Air Act. It was all-encompassing, and have continued to write about, and it's not hard to find, the many errors in the environmental initiative that a very aggressive EPA is taking on. But I've been so appalled at what in the last 5 years has gone on in EPA, particularly the deterioration of basic scientific sufficiency. And watching EPA continually and increasingly exercise a very formidable power that is contained in the Federal Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases either directly or using other rules intended to reduce conventional pollutants like mercury and sulfur dioxide to force the same agenda. I said, you know, this is the time to step back. This needs a broader perspective, and this needs some bold colors, because it's kind of an inflection point as a matter of policy, where you have a significant, perhaps a majority leaders of the free world who somehow think we can rapidly shift from fossil fuel-based energy to very inferior alternatives. It took me a little while to use phrases like, in all of human history, that would make me giggle. I had a very academic education, and I consider generalizations of that magnitude to be very dangerous and often an excuse for a lack of very specific evidence. And now I want to acknowledge who inspired this path and the research in this paper. And it's someone some of you may know in Washington, D.C., and that's Indur Ghaklani. In a wonderfully researched monograph for Cato, he several years ago issued a paper called Humanity Unbound: How Fossil Fuels Saved Man from Nature and Nature from Man. And that paper took me to some fascinating books, which are referenced throughout my paper, and a jillion papers in academic journals. And I became convinced that he is spot on in that paper, and the story, and this is a graph from Indur Ghaklani's paper. That same graph appears in other histories about human progress or economic history in the world, and is based on probably the most highly regarded statistics in what is an obscure discipline to many, macroeconomic global history. So this is pretty much the story of my paper, a graph, but that graph is about unbelievable improvements in the human condition, in the physical parameters of human existence. So abrupt and so radical, and we are the heirs of now a bounty of energy that is so embedded in all of our actions and physical objects, food we eat, that we don't notice it. That was recently brought to mind by a great paper by Mark P. Mills of the Manhattan Institute. The title of it is "The iCloud Begins with Coal." And the amount of energy, I was going to bring my cell phone so I could say, in all our devices, it's invisible. It's invisible. But the amount of electricity needed to support the digital universe is massive. I believe in his paper in 2012, that amount of energy was in excess of all global aviation, and is projected to rapidly increase because of the continual expansions and refinements of digital power. But this graph is worth going over a little bit before I get back to some general themes. All of human history, that's not all of human history, but no, stand by the mic. That's right. this measures from 0 AD to little after 2000 AD. But the same graph actually can be taken back to 8000 BC, which is a common date for the Neolithic agricultural revolution that moved man from caves to planting crops and cultivating animals rather than gathering what unassisted nature might provide. But for all this time, until the Industrial Revolution, it's dated variously, around 1800, 1750 to 1850, man's only source of energy was really what was available through solar energy and photosynthesis. Plants, living plants, and the animals who depended upon living plants, and all the materials made from plants and animals. A very limited flow of energy. And things didn't change much. I was skeptical about this at the beginning, but until around 1800, human life expectancy had hovered around 25 years of age, not because there were not some very old people, but because perhaps 30% of children died before they were 15. It took an abrupt shift, and it has tripled itself in the last 250 years, from a lifespan of about 25 to a lifespan of about 69. If that's not an improvement and a palpable benefit, I don't know what would be. Income, as measured as average income, global average per capita income, has increased 11-fold. And I, for some reason, can't keep straight how many times the population of the world has doubled. And as many of us in this room are old enough to have read Paul Ehrlich's The Population Explosion, rather than a rapidly growing world population causing mass starvation, another energy revolution dependent on fossil fuels, the 20th century agricultural revolution, vastly increased agricultural yield. A significant reason of that, there were many factors, interrelated factors, but natural gas-based fertilizer. To which is attributed about 40 to the 60% increased agricultural yield. But back to the graph, there's another line, which I believe is the green line, that is coincident with the same rise, and that is the increase of carbon dioxide emissions as a result of human activity. And it's not only a very tight correlation. Lots of historians that aren't even dealing with energy recognize, whether they call it productivity or whether they call it energy, that fossil fuels were a necessary condition of this remarkable, radical, abrupt, upward trend in the basic physical parameters of human existence. And necessary doesn't mean cause. Necessary means that would be a sufficient condition, and one can get into way too elaborate discussions of what a necessary condition is, but without which an upward movement in income, in productivity, in lifespan, in population would not have been possible. The thesis of my paper, said a little more succinctly, is that fossil fuels as a necessary condition of the Industrial Revolution made modern living standards possible, vastly improved living conditions across the whole world, much more in favored countries, largely which had legal institutions like England had at the time of the Revolution that upheld property rights, contractual transactions, and all of that. Those are also necessary conditions. But fossil fuels, very much a necessary condition. And you know, a graph with a line like that goes that flat for 1,000 years obviously does not catch the ups and downs and ups and downs. And obviously there were gains in stretching the limits of all the energy that the natural world made possible. There were plentiful windmills and water mills long before the English Industrial Revolution, but their gains were marginal. There was never the real basis for this kind of leap forward as far as economic productivity. And another unique factor is this economic boom, if you will, this Industrial Revolution, unlike previous, the greatest gains went to the poor. And there's much written about the extent to which the Industrial Revolution, as it first emerged in England, but also as it went elsewhere, the United States was shortly after, the greatest gains went to the poorest and to the unskilled. and allowed the emergence of a middle class where historians that take the big sweep of human history in a macroeconomic perspective, you really have a situation where you always have elites, comfortable elites, and you have most of the rest of the population does the work that makes possible the lifestyle of the elites through muscle energy. And the Industrial Revolution was the first time inanimate energy in fossil fuels were harnessed. I mentioned the agricultural revolution, but back to the Industrial Revolution. The productivity that increased rapidly in the Industrial Revolution is really worth a reflection. And that was, of course, when, for the first time in human history, that fossil fuels were converted from heat energy to mechanical energy. Machines that would do the work that otherwise was the physical labor of humans or animals. And the numbers, when you look at the productivity, that within 100 years from, say, 1750, the early days of the Industrial Revolution to the sort of flourishing about around 1850 are staggering. My paper has a number of those examples, but I just give you a couple of those. Textiles was even before the Industrial Revolution, the major industry in England, and it went in 100 years from in 1750 it took 18 and a half man-hours to convert a pound of cotton to cloth. In 1850, it took an hour. And gains like that, the productivity that mechanization made possible, is what allowed an economic growth never seen before, and that, as I said, was of most benefit, not to the elite, already wealthy elites, but to that mass and bulk of the population who really lived a subsistence income life through very, very heavy physical labor. A little step back to look at the foundation of this too, and then I want to talk about what very few do, the environmental benefits of fossil fuels, of which there are many. I don't know what your 8th grade science class was like, but I think mine was pretty dull. I have just vague memories, but that's where concepts like photosynthesis and the basic concepts of energy emerge. But we are so swathed in energy now. I don't think we have kind of instinctual sense of what are really like the metaphysics of physical human lives depend upon. And, you know, the secret of the Industrial Revolution, really, as many people pointed out, is using stored solar energy in place of current solar energy. And not only stored and not only accessible in large amounts, but dense energy concentrated through the same plants and animals that we can consume under current photosynthesis after millions of years of compression. And just this morning I was looking up, and the paper has a lot of these data. I don't want to put too many numbers in this these remarks, but power density is a concept frequently used in physics and in petroleum engineering and other energy-related enterprises. And the difference in power density measured in watts per square meter, which has to do with the extent of surface area of the Earth necessary to produce a certain volume, a certain density of energy or a certain density of power, is real interesting in understanding why renewables are far inferior to fossil fuels. The energy density, power density of a pretty marginal oil well is measured, and this is on EIA, the Energy Information Administration of this country website, is measured about 27 watts per square meter, and that's a pretty marginal well. The same unit of measurement, the solar voltaic is 0.05 in power density. So you have a contrast of 540 times difference in the power density involved. Excuse me. And now to the really environmental, what I call the environmental benefits of fossil fuels, which I have a particular interest in, having been an environmental regulator And nothing will amaze me anymore to hear Secretary of State John Kerry speak of carbon dioxide as among the most fearsome of weapons of destruction, most fearsome weapons of mass destruction, and to hear the President recently claim that ambient CO2 is causing heart attacks and premature mortality. And this is evidently polls for the last several years have shown really a declining interest in issues of global warming and climate change in the public at large, particularly if they're asked whether they would like to lose a nickel devoted to those issues. But evidently these issues are gaining traction, again, in the public. And it certainly is not the time to go into that. I wrote a paper once this year, a couple of years ago, called EPA's Pretense of Science, Regulating Phantom Risks. And this EPA is using what benefits in like 6 other different rules that they attribute to fine particulate matter to be the basis of the claim, because if there's particulate matter, that would be as a result of burning fossil fuels, that CO2 is indeed, the gas of life, is indeed causing heart attacks. Unbelievable. One of the greatest benefits of environmental fuels is related to what I was just speaking about in terms of power density. The human use of fossil fuels, as opposed to using what nature provided, has shrunk the human footprint. You know, man's need for food and materials has been the greatest source of disruption or elimination of vast natural ecosystems. And many people are concerned about have been on a variety of issues, the extent to the loss of biodiversity as a result of that. Renewables expand the human footprint. Fossil fuels dramatically shrink it. To have fed the world's population in 2007, you would have to have used 1.5 times the amount of land that is currently used as agricultural land across the world. You would have had to almost doubled the amount of land to which crops are devoted instead of to. So fossil fuels are efficient and they shrink the human footprint. And you know, they're so vilified for so many years that people often think we need a new name for them. And some people talk about them as hydrocarbons instead of fossil fuels. But an environmental benefit, a very indirect one, is, yes, uncontrolled combustion of fossil fuels releases all kinds of pollutants, which in certain exposures can be harmful to human health, but they can be controlled. They can be controlled. Some of and most, vilified currently issues about coal, the claims made are on the basis of uncontrolled emissions. And having worked in a very large environmental regulatory agency for many years, it is amazing, another step forward for mankind, the extent to which those emissions can be reduced and eliminated by multiple times fold. You can find on EPA's website, although it's hardly ever mentioned, their data demonstrating lead is eliminated by 97%. That's pretty much a victory. Sulfur dioxide now up to 80%, and all the emission control technology, to which I credit industry, that has been developed and is ever improved, have vastly improved and reduced anything at the level of harmful to human beings. And now, really back to the policy imperatives of all of this. I think this is really an inflection point. And we all know an inflection point means a point on a line or a curve where it changes direction. If it's going up, it goes the other way. I think on the graph that is up there, there is at the top of the of the vertical axis, there's already been a step down. And I think of reading news clips about emerging energy poverty or increasing energy poverty in Europe, where the Daily Mail, an English newspaper, talks about 24,000 elderly vulnerable this year during the winter because of inability to pay for electricity. Germany is the example that I find most disturbing. Germany, the second most industrialized country in the world after the United States, taking a rapid rush to renewables several years ago, and then exacerbating it by a very quick response after the typhoon and excuse me, in Fukuyama, is that it, in Japan, to early retire their nuclear. Their papers, Der Spiegel and Die Welt, they're major newspapers, not sideline views, talk about 400 to 500,000 households which no longer use electricity because it's too expensive, because it's 3 times higher. It's 3 times higher than the average U.S. And increasingly view electricity as a luxury good. That's definitely a step down. I think that would have to be the first energy regression in human history, to elect a decline. And also Germany's using more coal because, in fact, what the task that they had set out for renewables is not being accomplished, and more coal. And they're in a very precarious position regarding their natural gas imports, for which they've become wholly dependent because significant amounts of them come from Vladimir Putin. It's still appalling to me how far we are toward really significantly either supplanting fossil fuels or people who really readily talk about eliminating them within 20 years. If you look at the history of energy transitions, there's centuries that have evolved. I mean, and by that, not something as fundamental as the use of renewable energies rather than fossil fuel energies. Very difficult ones. Fossil fuels are superior to renewable energy sources. I would love to debate someone who would draw an opposite conclusion in, as I believe I said earlier, in energy density, in power density, in reliability, in versatility, in controllability and scalability. Renewables come far, far short, and fossil fuels do not. How can supplanting fossil fuel-based energy with renewables be possibly justified by the science which is now used to do that? The IPCC science, highly politicized from the beginning, over 3 decades, built of speculative models with very, very questionable assumptions about the extent to which the natural forces of the climate immediately give way to increased atmospheric CO2. Can that kind of science, increasingly discredited by now observational evidence, can that science really be used to justify risking the well springs of what we now enjoy? And who knows what the future will bring. This is not intended to be a pain to fossil fuels, because who knows what new energy sources of very creative human minds would do. But to pull the rug underneath the living conditions we have and to deny them to the billions in the world that have never seen a light switch, what could be a more heinous human error? Who knows what the future will bring? But I'd like to close with a quote from Matt Ridley's The Rational Optimist. And if you have not read that book, it's just a delight. And it is packed with facts and data, but he's an extremely gifted writer. And I understand he was the keynote speaker tonight at the CEI anniversary. But Matt Ridley says it best. Non-renewable resources such as coal, natural gas, and oil are sufficiently abundant to allow an expansion of both economic activity and population to the point where they generate sustainable wealth for all people. For all people. And they can do so without hitting a Malthusian ceiling. And then they can hand the baton to some other form of energy. The blinding brightness of this realization still amazes me. We can build a civilization in which everybody lives like the Sun King, because everybody is served by and serves 1,000 servants, each of whose service is amplified by extraordinary amounts of inanimate energy, in which he means fossil fuels. I hope this kind of information and this treatment is valuable to any of you in the work that you do, but I think that this is the time, at this stage in the evolution of climate policy, we now have the full coercive power of the federal government through the Clean Air Act, taking on what is, if it's not an intent to eliminate fossil fuels, or if it's not an attempt to prematurely jeopardize the energy on which we all depend, or if it's just hacking away at it. It is like no other country in the world. The Clean Air Act gives incredible powers of enforcement to the federal government, and so this is the time, I think, to respond with the most important thing. What is the measure? What is the measure of the policy decision? Is not human well-being, is not the opportunity for the rest of the world who does not enjoy the energy bounty that we have. It must be somehow the basic human well-being must be a factor in the equation of this issue of our age. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and we do want to open the floor to questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to arrive, and then introduce yourself to us. There's one right here.
Bonner Cohen, National Center for Public Policy Research. At the beginning of your remarks, you mentioned all the mischief that's going on at EPA and, for that matter, elsewhere, regarding the social cost of carbon. And we all know what song and dance is going on here. Once the social costs have been of carbon have been determined, that will then provide justification for further regulatory action to crack down on fossil fuels and anything else that is associated with the production of fossil fuels. Now, doesn't that really cry out for a counter study, namely the social cost of non-carbon?
Right.
The return to the world that you and Indira Gokilani and others have described that predated the Industrial Revolution, that is, greatly reduced life expectancy, widespread disease, and all the things that go along with that. I see David Kreutzer is down here in the first row. He may already have thought of doing something like that himself. If not, there's a suggestion, but I would appreciate your comments on that, and thank you very much.
Well, I think that also, I would say. Indira Gokilani and the EPA's, the manner in which they developed the methodology for social cost of carbon. This is, perhaps needless to say, a historical narrative of the social benefits of carbon. And I think you could, and it's not my kind of field, but I think you could develop metrics and also really take on the metrics used in the social cost of carbon, which is wild. But as far as there's similar, are there not, David, similar metrics for, you know, EPA's own metrics for the value of human life? I think there'd be better, yeah, right. And the scope of the middle class versus the all of those things. I think it's a great project.
Okay. Who else do we have? Back row there?
Yes, good afternoon. My name's Ted Conwell. I'm with Climate First. Our mission is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as fast as possible and push renewable energy. Thank you for coming. I appreciate hearing your talk. I just had one question. How do you square the fact that on one hand you say EPA is dealing with deteriorating science, but on the other hand you say that lead emissions under the Clean Air Act has been reduced 97%, and sulfur dioxide emissions has also been reduced 80%. How do you square those two things? On one hand, EPA is doing a terrible job, and on the other hand, under the Clean Air Act, which EPA obviously administers, are they doing a good job on the other hand?
If I understand your question, here's how I would respond. the Clean Air Act was enacted and designed for conventional pollutants about which greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide was never even conceived to be a part of. Pollutants which at measured levels in the ambient atmosphere and the kind of exposure to which are potentially cause health effects. And that was what, was the basis of the risk assessments on airborne lead. And over time, and it was always incremental and slowly, there were mandates to reduce that, and they worked. And that one was actually pretty easy because lead in gasoline was eliminated. But CO2, I do not find credible EPA's endangerment finding that carbon dioxide is a pollutant that harms human health within the meaning of the Clean Air Act. So, and they're using an act designed for what I call genuine pollutants, in which the law lists, and I find no dispute among the technical community, toxicologists, and so that those are pollutants which can risk human health. But the risk to human health EPA attributes to carbon dioxide is 50 or 100 years from now, some temperature that would not be healthy. That's very, very different than the impact of walking out that door and inhaling what that air is. Very, very different. The law was not intended to predict what will occur 50 or 100 years from now.
Okay, I saw another hand right here on the front row. Oh, Fred?
Talking about the benefits of carbon dioxide, something that is sadly neglected by the Office of Management and Budget when they discuss social cost of carbon. Do you make a distinction between the direct benefits to agriculture and the indirect benefits that you've discussed here to economic growth?
Right. But the paper goes on at far greater length two benefits of carbon dioxide to agriculture. Well, probably more than two, but two main ones. One is that, it's a plant food, has been known for 200 years, identified as a plant food. So there are hundreds of studies about which you may be more aware than I am, Dr. Singer, that the slightly increased ambient concentration of CO2 as a result of fossil fuel use is acting to increase plant productivity right now. CO2 is the compound that enables plants to build plant tissue. So and the plant does not distinguish between man-made and natural CO2. So that's one. The other is the enormous gains made through natural gas-based fertilizer. So two. One, that the man-made CO2 that's in the atmosphere, and there have been, hear people talk about hundreds of studies about that, agronomists trying to measure it. And then the other is a 40 to 60% increased in agricultural yield as a result of natural gas.
Okay, here in the front row.
Just want to make two quick comments. You're talking about those
And
studies.
your name is?
I'm sorry, I'm David Kreutzer with the Heritage Foundation.
Sorry.
You mentioned that just as Joe Bass showed up, and the publication they put out on the science of the biological science of CO2.
The non-intergovernmental panel.
Non-intergovernmental. But the other comment I wanted to make is when you turn this book into a movie, make sure that you do the extension of that graph that you use an electric forklift to show where GDP is going to be if we allow it to grow.
That's a good point.
Okay, very good. Any further questions? Well, very good. Let's thank our speaker, Kathleen. Now, we do have copies of this study, Fossil Fuels, the Moral Case. There are many more graphs in it. There's much more detail. There's a great bibliography, lots of footnotes. It's a very, very fine paper. It's something that we want everyone here who's interested in science, good science, to be sure to take a copy of and study and read and come back in a month for the quiz. Thank you all for coming today. We are grateful that you came. We're grateful for those who are watching on the internet and on television, and appreciate your time and attention. We are dismissed.